The coronavirus, as it has in so many other spaces, has really laid bare some racial dynamics that have been present in this country for a long time. Sadly, anti-Asian discrimination and activities have ramped up because of false ideas about the coronavirus. And of course, even more sadly, we had the events in Atlanta very, very recently. So all of those things make today's conversation extremely important. And the team from the Office of Inclusion and Engagement and from the Office of Diversity Community Engagement and from the Affinity Group have put together a great lineup for you. So I'm going to get out of the way, and I am going to, for the introductions of our speaker, hand things off to my colleague and friend, our Dean of Students, Aaron Isaacs.
Hi, thank you, Fred, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll echo the sentiments expressed by Chris and Fred, and that over the past year, we've witnessed a resurgence in anti-Asian hate, most recently in the violence that took the lives of 8 folks, 6 who were Asian women in Atlanta, Georgia. The violence and hate against Asian communities is fortunately not new in the US. Rather, anti-Asian violence and hate is deeply woven into the fabric of this country. The US has a long-standing history of xenophobia, exclusion, internment, exploitation of Asian and biopic groups as a means to exert dominance, control, and justify violence. For today's conversation, in order to adequately address this hate and violence, it is imperative that we engage in the critical dialogue that acknowledges the true history of oppression and hate in this country, elevates the voices and narratives of those on the margins who are subjected to this violence, and actively engage in understanding the complex intersection of gender, race, class, labor, immigration, and other oppressive systems that seek to minoritize and marginalize groups. To our AAPI community, we see you, we value you, and will continue to work in solidarity to address the racism and violence in our communities, both locally and nationally. With that said, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's community conversation, who are using their identity, position, and platform to bring awareness and garner action in support of the AAPI community. Our first guest, Attorney General William Tong, is the 25th Attorney General to serve Connecticut and the first Asian American elected at a statewide level in Connecticut. Before his election as AG, Tong served 12 years in Connecticut's General Assembly, representing the 147th District, which includes North Stamford and Darien. Most recently, Tong served as the House Chairman of the Judiciary Committee. In this position, Tong was responsible for all legislation related to constitutional law, criminal law, civil rights, consumer protection, probate, judicial nominations, and the judicial branch. During his service in the legislature, Tong helped lead passage of landmark legislation, including Connecticut's Second Chance Act, Domestic Violence Restraining Order Act, Lost and Stolen Firearms Act, and the Act Protecting School Children. He has practiced law for the last 18 years as a litigator in both state and federal courts, first at Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett in New York City, and for the past 15 years with Finn Dixon and Hurling in Stamford. Our second guest today is Na-Rae Kim, Assistant Professor in Residence, Asian and Asian American Studies at UConn. She received her PhD in English from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. She specializes in transnational Korean literature, Asian American literature, history, and the theory of the novel, and critical Asian studies. Her research examines 20th century neo-imperial exchanges between South Korea and the United States, through which both nation states began to reimagine ideal citizens as subjects exhibiting transnational sensibilities. She traces these processes via literary and cultural and political representations of Korean labor migrants, Korean Americans, and most recently, North Korean refugees. Please join me in welcoming Attorney General William Tong and Assistant Professor Na-Rae Kim for today's community conversation. Attorney Tong, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean. I want to thank the Dean and the Provost and Chris Grant for inviting me. Thank you to the university for hosting this important conversation today. And a special thanks to my very good friend, Professor Lee, in the UHART Biology Department. Lily's a great friend, and I really appreciate your leadership, Lily, in pulling us all together for this conversation. It's an incredibly important conversation. Let me also say that I feel like a member of the family because my uncle, Roger's son, graduated from the University of Hartford back in the 80s. And it was during that time that my uncle was a graduate student in computer science, and my parents ran a Chinese restaurant in Wethersfield, and they were in the restaurant 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. And it was very hard for them to pick me up from school. So my uncle would go pick me up from school in West Hartford, and he would have class usually in the late afternoon and the evenings at UHart. And so he would put me in the student center. There was a little arcade back in the 80s in the student center. With the students who we're addressing today don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about arcades and big stand-up video game machines. And there were those old style vending machines where you could get like an egg salad sandwich, out of the vending machine, probably like for $1 back then. So he would drop me in the student center at the University of Hartford, and I would eat egg salad sandwiches with a pocket full of quarters, and I would play asteroids, waiting for my uncle to finish class. So in that way, the University of Hartford played a really important role in my childhood and growing up, and made all this possible. So thank you. Let me say, first, it's my incredible honor to be your Attorney General. I'm the first Asian American elected at the state level and the statewide level in Connecticut's history. I wish I could say that I'm the first elected Asian American Attorney General in the history of our country. I can't say that. Kamala Harris screws the whole thing up for me. I'm the third elected AAPI Attorney General. I am the first elected Chinese American Attorney General of any state in our nation's history. But if you were listening closely, I said elected. There are appointed attorneys general in some states, and there have been appointed attorneys general in Hawaii. Hawaii screws the whole thing up for me too. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve as Connecticut's chief legal officer and to work for all of you. And it was my distinct honor and pleasure to work in the General Assembly and represent Stamford and New Canaan and Darien for 12 years. So I was asked to say a few things about my experience. And since we're talking about hate and discrimination and increasing hate and discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about my own experience. And of course, I was born and raised here in Connecticut, born in Hartford Hospital. My parents ran a Chinese restaurant and small businesses for most of my life. And as an Asian American, as a Chinese American, for those of you who have that experience, or as an experience, or have the experience of being a person of color, or from a minority or marginalized community, it is a fact of life that you suffer hate, racism, discrimination, and indignities in small and big ways. On most days, if not every day of your life. And I'm no different than all of you and the students and faculty and staff who live with this every day. And I'm very lucky, of course, to sit here in my office as your Attorney General, and I have a lot of people looking out for me. But even as Attorney General, once I was elected, and particularly when you saw a lot of hatred directed at Asian Pacific Americans, including by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, you saw an uptick in attacks on me on our social media channels. For example, shortly after I was elected, I was called Kim Jong Tong. My name is regularly mocked and ridiculed. I've been called a Manchurian AG. And now I am routinely accused of being an agent of the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, as I said before, I was born in Hartford Hospital, and I'm as American as anybody else on this call. I will tell you, of course, that much of that doesn't have any effect on me. I'd be lying if I said it didn't bother me. Of course it bothers me. but it's really no skin off my back, of course, and I sign up for some of this as a public official, I assume. But let me tell you about experience that really hurt and really hit home. When I was running for Attorney General, I was in the legislature already for 11 years, and I was very senior in the legislature. I was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And I'd done a lot of work on issues that people really care about: gun violence, domestic violence, civil rights, criminal justice reform. And a lot of that work had my signature. It was really what I focused a lot of my personal and professional time on, and I had developed a reputation for it. And so I was talking to a delegate, Democratic delegate, who was a woman, who was a lawyer, and I asked her for her support. And she said, "William, I love your work in the General Assembly, and as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I'm really impressed by all that you've done." And I said, "Great. Can I count on your support at the state Democratic State Convention?" And she said, "No, I'm sorry, I can't support you." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, you just don't look like what I think an attorney general should look like." And if you think about what she was trying to tell me and unpack all of that, this just happened a couple of years ago. And at that time, I was a major party candidate for attorney general. And, I took that call in the car, and I remember just taking my headphones out and sitting back and just being stunned. I've been asked when I've told that story, "Well, what did you do? What did you say?" And I wish I could say that in that moment I had some grandiloquent response, right? But like anybody, I was deeply offended and shocked by somebody telling me this. And I couldn't get off the phone fast enough. And I think that's just a microcosm of what people go through every day. And for me, I'm very lucky that somebody didn't attack me or threaten me or hurt me. But I think that experience tells a lot about not just my experience and the fact that Asian Americans, like many people of color, experience hatred and discrimination on an everyday basis and racism on an everyday basis, just in the coming and going of our lives, right, in our professional lives. But on top of that, I think that person made that comment. I mean, I assume this person, she was a lawyer, she's a woman, she was progressive. I assume if we were to have her on this call right now, that she would say all the right things, right? And would profess there's not a racist bone in her body. But I think what that showed is that people don't even think about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders when it comes to racism and hate and discrimination. To be an Asian American and Pacific Islander in this country, in part, is to be invisible in this conversation about race and racism and hate. And that is not only incredibly hurtful and dismissive, and it denies who you are as a human being, and it just denies your very existence. But it also makes us unsafe. It makes us unsafe because if people don't see you, and thank you, Dean Isaacs, for saying that you see us. But if you, sorry, that's a coffee machine behind me. If you don't see us, that means that people don't know that you're at risk, and they don't know that you're in danger, and they don't take steps to protect you. And that's the final thought I want to leave you with. And that is the stereotypes and the hatred directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is particularly dangerous for our community. And what do I mean by that? It's not just the invisibility. It's not just the fact that people don't even understand or reckon with the history, right? This idea that some people have said, and you may have seen some coverage, that a state legislator remarked that Asian Americans have not experienced racism and discrimination, which is an absurd and deeply hurtful comment. It's not just that people don't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, or they don't remember the beating death of Vincent Chin, or they seem to have forgotten that we interned 125,000 Japanese Americans in camps, American citizens, by the way, in camps on American soil, and we scapegoated them and blamed them for Pearl Harbor and World War II. Sound familiar? Sound familiar because, you know, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, did it again when he blamed Chinese Americans and Asian Americans for the coronavirus and called it the China virus or the Kung flu. It's not just that. It's also the stereotypes about us. And this is why stereotypes are so important. I mean, sometimes people say, you know, these insults, what's the big deal? Well, let me tell you what the big deal is. There are pernicious stereotypes, hateful stereotypes about Asian Americans, that we're quiet, that we're meek, that we're bookish. Frankly, the model minority stereotype is deeply damaging. And that we don't rock the boat, right? We just put our heads down and we don't rock the boat. And by the way, a lot of Asian Americans buy into these stereotypes too. And they've internalized this nonsense. And let's take it a step further and talk about Asian American women. Asian American women are highly objectified in modern culture and media. Through a racist lens, they're seen as exotic, right? And they're over-sexualized. And what these stereotypes and hateful images produce is an idea, a false idea, that Asian Americans are weaker or quieter or unwilling to push back or fight back. And so what does that tell somebody who would prey on Asian Americans or want to hurt somebody else? That tells the shooter and the murderer in Atlanta, Georgia, right, that the other Asian Americans are weak, and so I can prey on them. So let's be honest, the guy in Georgia did not go after 6 men who were 6'4", 300 pounds, right? He went after Asian American women because society tells him that they are weak, and in a warped way, it is okay for you to prey upon them. And that's why I want, that's the message I want to deliver, is that these stereotypes are cumulative, right? And in particular for the Asian American community, it's the invisibility that we must confront every day, plus the particular nature of the stereotypes that make Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders unsafe. Well, let me close by saying that I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and frankly, Senator Blumenthal's having another event after this where he's going to do the same thing in calling attention to this crisis and in seeing us. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for acknowledging our humanity. Thank you for acknowledging our suffering. Thank you also for acknowledging our strength, right, in our courage. And the students and the faculty and staff who are going to step forward and tell their stories. Thank you, Professor, for also being a part of this conversation, Professor Kim. And I really appreciate everybody coming together to support all of our communities, but in this moment, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community in particular. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General, and thank you everyone for this really generous and important conversation. Picking up from what the Attorney General has said, I'm going to give a little bit of a historical context to this particular invisibility of Asian Americans and some of the stereotypes. And I wanted to pick up on this idea of invisibility and talk about how Asian Americans have always been invisible in America. But at the same time, Asian Americans were not just flat and visible, they were actually visible, but only in very particular ways. Visible as nail salon workers, visible as grocers, visible as migrant workers. So I want to talk about some of those historical events and incidents. And in order to do that, I wanted to share my screen. Can everyone see that's fine? So United States likes to think of itself as a nation of immigrants, but when you actually look at the history of Asian migration, it tells a different story. It shows us that it is actually a history of exclusion. So in that sense, immigrant historians call America not a nation of immigrants, but a nation of gatekeeping. One of the first things to note, I wanted to talk a little bit about representation. So here's like two quotes, one of which is a little disclaimer from the movie Year of the Dragon, which has a lot of harmful stereotypes that the Attorney General also mentioned about China and Chinatown. And when people protested, they decided to put up this sign in the beginning, says, this film does not intend to demean or to ignore the many positive features of Asian Americans and specifically Chinese American communities. Any similarities are accidental. Classic disclaimer that you see in many movies, right? And then the second quote is from Helen Zia, who is an Asian American activist. And she says, she names the stereotypes, right? She specifically starts by naming the stereotypes and says, well, there were very specific number of stereotypes against Asian and Asian American women and men, which tends to be only geishas, gooks, or geeks. And they have been just the staples of the main characters of mass culture's Asian universe: subservient, passive female, the untrustworthy, evil male, the ineffectual, emasculated nerd. And each stereotypes gained a foothold in the popular culture, and it brought on new prejudices that real life Asian Americans would have to then contend with, right? So I wanted to start by these two quotes, by putting them together. This idea that representation does not have to do with the real life because it does not exist and it was just a mistake. And other statement by Asian American woman who says, well, in the world that I lived in, Asian Americans were seldom acknowledged, and there were only a few representations of us, which tend to box us as geishas and gooks and geeks. And that had real repercussions because many people didn't fully understand who Asian Americans are, but they resorted to these popular imaginations, right? So I wanted to start by saying that this lack of representations of Asian Americans, or this invisibility of them, this continued invisibility or selective visibility of Asian Americans in America, have real life repercussions, such as the Georgia shooting that we have seen. And I want to also point out that the Georgia shooting is not exceptional thing. It is symptomatic of our historical context, and it actually aligns with the longer history of racism and hatred toward Asians in America. So the history of Asian migration to the United States dovetails with the abolition. Slavery ended in the British Empire in 1807, and which definitely then created the lack of laborers. There was shortage, and this was profitable business. And then people started to think, oh, then what do? We have a shortage. We need to continue our business. So it is a sad irony that the first shipment of Chinese laborers by a British company was actually the same year that the slavery was abolished, So that people who were talking about the freedom and human rights, therefore, let's abolish slavery, were actually the same people who then thought, okay, we can bring in these people, but because it was free before, let's pay them just really little money. There are many, many accounts by people in this time period, including the petition by Xenophobia in Cuba, that says that the treatment of these Asian laborers was horrendous. Because of the initial incipient moment of the way in which these people were brought into America, and the larger Americas, by what I mean America at this point, many people were flogged. They were indentured laborers, but they were treated as like servants. They were flogged, they were not fed well, they were malnourished. Actually, there are some accounts that in some plantations, 75% of the people died after, even before their contracted term ended. And these people and these treatment continued on. This is a famous photo that you all probably know, the photo of the completion of the Transcontinental Railway. And what is interesting about this picture is that the actual people who completed this railroad is not present. So I wanted to give you a different image of the Chinese people who are laying the last rail, of the actual migrant Chinese workers who came and built America, who are unacknowledged, who are not considered important enough to be treated well or to be included in official photos that remembers this historical moment. As these Chinese workers started to trickle in to fill the labor vacuum, what also happened was the rise of anti-Chinese sentiments. As you can see in these ads, the Magic Washer in 1886 and the Rock Island and Pacific Railroad advertisement in 1872, anti-Chinese sentiment rose very quickly. I wanted to point out, for instance, this very strange deformed bodies of the Chinese people who America brought in order to again meet its needs. And this idea of devious, less than human, very evilly racialized and deceitful Chinese workers started to abound so that it would make its way to cultural RAM and popular ads such as the Magic Washer and Rock Island Route, which has nothing to do with immigration. Also abounding was this idea that these Chinese people and Chinatown, so immigrant, especially Asian immigrant enclaves, are vile, that it's morally depraved and it is on its way to also decay American morality. Therefore, these people need to be controlled, and these people should not come to America anymore, even though forgetting the initial root of why they are here and why they had to form separate immigrant enclaves. Again, because these people were not welcomed into other neighborhoods, or these people did not necessarily make enough money to venture and make other places of living. They were put into immigrant enclaves, which then were cast as bad and negative and evil, pollutant, antithetical to what is American. So very soon, by 1875 and 1882, started these immigration acts. The Page Act of 1875 says that if you are a Chinese woman and if you are a prostitute or if you are not healthy, you cannot come into America. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 categorically stops the migration of Chinese laborers with a slim exempt class of merchants and diplomats and students. What it did was to create this idea that that race and immigration, and particular race and particular class, should be banned from not only being Americans at this point, but from even entering America. And this had a lasting impact in changing how America thought about race and immigration and the United States identity as a nation made by immigration. It instead started this idea that immigrants should be measured into its America's ideas of fitness. And the ideas of fitness had to do largely with immigrants' race and ethnicity and class and gender. And Asian immigrants were specifically thought as not good enough, that it doesn't measure up, therefore it cannot be American. And it continued to change how people thought about Asians. Once the popular sentiment was codified into law, this law then legitimized how people thought about immigrants. It not only gave immigrant officials ways to weaponize their stereotypes and racist ideas to bar certain people from entering into America, but it continued to form how America thinks about native-born people and people who are immigrants but of Asian descent. Angel Island Immigration and Detention Center was in operation from 1910 to 1940. And people often think about the Ellis Island Immigration and Detention Center, but I wanted to highlight how in Angel Island Immigration and Detention Center, which was in operation, because of this remnants of the Chinese Immigration Act and Chinese Exclusion Act that was still in operation. And because of this rising anti-Chinese sentiment that never actually stopped, people continued to continue to consider Chinese immigrants as needing to be controlled and Asian immigrants as people who need to be considered as suspects who are again un-American. What also happened in this time period was the rise of Japan as an imperial power. And what I also wanted to talk about was the way in which that as the Chinese laborers could not enter into America because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, while this idea of imperial Japan as evil, again, about to harm white women and about to conquer the whole world, all these ideas about evil Japan rise up, Japanese people started trickling into America as laborers in order to fill, again, the labor vacuum that was created by the Chinese Exclusion Act in late 1880s. However, very quickly, as you can see in this couple of slides, by 1920s, but actually even before that, as early as 1903, we come to find these ideas that Japanese people are also bad. Similar to Chinese people, they should not come in. You can see this Senate election poster that says, "Save our state from Oriental aggression," right? Again, this idea of this horde of Orients about to come to our neighborhood and about to devour us, about to change America into what it is not and what it should not be, abound in popular imagination, in political realms, in cultural realm. By 1924, when the president signs the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act that bars Asians, including Japanese, from entering into America, newspapers celebrate that as saying it is a Japanese ban. It's not just this idea of protecting America from the way in which it considers what it should be in terms of Immigration and Nationality Act, but it specifically codifies this as a Japan ban. As Japan continued to rise as an imperial power, American popular media continues to depict Japanese people and also in its extension, this conflated Asians as evil people who are about to take America and devour it. So there were a lot of propaganda war posters that, for instance, like these, again, similar to some of the Chinese, anti-Chinese posters that I shared earlier on, that demonize and animalizes and dehumanizes Japanese people. So you see, for instance, the Office of War Efforts put out this poster that racializes Japanese and Chinese in particular ways, but in a way that demonizes them and that casts them into the stereotypes in the same way. Even though in this poster, it sort of says that Chinese are better, our allies, and Japanese are evil, what it actually does is to map out racist traits onto the Asian body. What also happened, sadly, was this continual idea that Japanese Americans are Japanese, that even though Japanese Americans are born in America and are equally Japanese citizens, are American citizens, I'm sorry, they're continually seen as actually loyal to Japan, not America. So there were many people who thought that Japanese Americans, at the call of its motherland, Japan, will go back to Japan or will bomb America, will harm America, and will attack it. So when the Pearl Harbor attack happened in 1941, American government actually has already kept a watch list of Japanese people, especially prominent leaders who are not necessarily had any reason to be suspicious because there was no evidence to consider them as evil or as suspicious, but just because they were prominent leaders or religious leaders, or because they ran organizations that had to do with Japanese community. So when the president signed the Executive Order 9066 saying that any and all persons of Japanese ancestry should be removed from sensitive military areas in 4 Western states, Japanese Americans, American citizens, more than 120,000 of them were rounded up and incarcerated in internment camps. It took them over 40 years for America to actually own up to that and say that it was, quote, racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a lack of political leadership, end quote, that led to the incarceration of these people who are American citizens. And I want to highlight the fact that Italian Americans or German Americans have not suffered the same fate. This thing, as the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 specifies, was born out of racial prejudice. It seemed that Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans were doing better as time went on into 60s and 70s with the civil liberties, with the civil rights movement and all that. But what also rose was this other stereotype of Asian Americans as the model minority. This stereotype seemingly praises Asian Americans as a successful minority, good at work, successful in academics, good jobs, well-paying jobs, and they make decent enough money and whatnot. But what it actually does is to pit Asian Americans against other minority, while also not acknowledging the heterogeneity and diversity and the immense wealth gap within Asian American community. And it's also important to mention that what started the naming of this stereotype was from 2 articles, Success Story of One Minority Group and Success Story Japanese American Style, which both of which were published in 1966. And when you actually read these articles, they actually iterate very harmful stereotypes of Japanese Americans, saying that it is rooted in their gene, right? It's rooted in Japanese culture, in their gene to be diligent. That's why they were successful. Again, not understanding that being Japanese Americans means anything other than having this Japanese culture that makes them then successful. Continually pinning Asian Americans' traits or livelihood or experience in America on their Japaneseness, while not recognizing the racial system or the structure of racism that also shapes their experience. In the same time period, refugees start to trickle in. America starts multiple wars in Asia during this time period of Cold War. In places like Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, and Japan, Asia became hot war zone. And as America goes to Asia, in terms of war, it creates domestic unrest and many Asians start to migrate to the United States. Specifically, many refugees come as the result of the Vietnam War. And this had to do, and this is also then this complicates the model minority myth, because even though America continued to think that Asian Americans are a good minority, they are doing well, they have settled, they are successful, it does not acknowledge this new wave of refugees who were suffering and for whom there were not enough adequate structures of support to help them settle in America. In 80s, there were again this ideas of anti-Asian sentiment that rose up as American car company has had troubles, and it had perceived competition with Japan. There were a lot of Japan bashing, as you can see in this image, which also led to the killing of Vincent Chin in 1882. And people, including Kaufman, who was the judge who ruled the case, who presided the case, and Ibens and Nitz, who were the perpetrators who killed Vincent Chin, says that it was because of you guys that we are out of work. Again, showing the racist bigotry which led to the killing of Vincent Chin. And Judge Kaufman says, well, actually, even though this Evans and Nitz, the oppressors, said that that it's because of this little quote unquote motherfuckers that we are out of work, which seems racially motivated. Well, they are not that kind of people. You don't make punishment fit the crime, you make the punishment fit the criminal. Don't be prejudiced. These white people are good, right? So there were this continued sentiments that Asians are to blame for America's problem. However, other people in authority, like in law enforcement and the judge who continued to defend these rhetorics saying, well, these are not that kind of people. These are good white people. Maybe those Asians must have done something wrong to aggravate them. That kind of rhetoric condoning violence against Asians led to creation of comic books like this, Sorry About That, in 1968, which some of the GIs brought back when they traveled back from Asia back to America. They had racist encounters. They brought their racist ideas to Asia when they went to fight, which was then enhanced because Asians were the people that they were shooting against, and Asian women were the people who they have sexually exploited. And then they brought those ideas back to the United States, and that lingered in the popular media to not only dehumanize Asians, but to continue to give legitimacy to those racist ideas that these GIs brought back, which led to continued creation of false representations of Asians and Asian Americans in media. For instance, even now in 2020, Hollywood Diversity Report says that over 91% of the executive and major and mid-level studios were white people, and Asian American filmmakers were only 3.3%. So there is a long way to go for us to fully redress the harmful effects of those bad representations and wrong representations that were created. Some of the specifically bad representations that were created or at the turn of the century that still continues to this date is this idea of the lotus blossom or dragon lady of Asian women, that Asian women are subservient and servile and submissive and also sexual subject, therefore lotus blossom, or about to come and get you, are sexually exploitative, but is menacing, this other stereotype, the dragon lady. And which this kind of dichotomy of good sexual object or bad sexual object, what ultimately they do is to continue to stereotype Asian American women as sexual object, whether good or bad. And this kind of images continued on. So for instance, when Anna May Wong was in an interview, she's considered as one of the first Asian American women who had a successful career. Although by successful career, she had some major roles, but was never good roles. She laments that why is it on the screen, Chinese is nearly always the villain of the piece and so cruel, murderous, treacherous, a snake in the grass. This representation continues on. So for instance, in a very popular show, Miss Saigon, that romanticizes the love story between a Vietnamese prostitute and an American GI. It continues to come to Broadway, continues to hit theater in many different states, and it was even revived on the Broadway for a limited time, despite the AAPI community's continued protest, saying that it is not a good representation, it lies about Asian women, and it romanticizes exploitation of Asian women during war times. This changes the representation of Asian American women as only sexual and dehumanized, changes with the more productions by Asians and Asian American directors and producers. However, still there is again a long way to go. As you can see in some of these images, Asian American women have been continually seen in American media as sexualized and as exploitable. And as I said before, 3.3% of Asian American directors and producers are, this number didn't increase not just because there weren't enough talent, but because there are people who continue to bar Asian American story from being the mainstream story, from being the American story. People continue to think that Asian Americans are little group within America who have their own things, but it does not speak to the whole fabric of American life at our time, which continues to reinforce the stereotypes that Asian Americans are different, un-American, or only particularly American. But that is, again, not true. Asian Americans are as Americans as any other racial groups and have been continually contributing to American history, as you have seen from the very beginning, from the Transcontinental Railroad, filling important vacuums and labors, and also contributing in terms of many different advancements in American culture and history. I'm going to end there and let other, and I can talk more about this for the Q&A session if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. At this time, I'm going to turn over to Lisa Cody, our assistant, one of our assistant directors in the Office of Inclusion, Engagement and Inclusion. Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for such an informative presentation. I can certainly say that is more AAPI history than I've ever received in my education. So I appreciate you taking the time to share with us today. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Lisa Cote, and I am the Assistant Director of Engagement, Support, and Development in the Office of Student Engagement and Inclusion. And one of our students and I will be doing the Q&A session. So Rena, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name is Rena. I'm a junior here at the university studying finance. I'm also a part of the Asian Student Association, where I'm the treasurer. And a little bit about the organization, we basically strive to just appreciate and spread awareness of Asian culture on and off campus. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I definitely appreciate this conversation, and I'm sure many of my peers who have joined also do. So we've definitely come up with a list of some discussion questions, but we want to also open the floor to anyone in the attendees list who has any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. But we can start with the first question, which is, to what degree is a lack of education and awareness about the history of Asian Americans contributing to the sentiment today?
I would say everything. It's because of this idea that Asian Americans are not quintessential part of American history. People continue to silo them as this other group of people whose experience we don't need to really think about or care about. And that kind of misinformation or structural erasure of Asian Americans from American consciousness continues to continue to let Asian Americans become the victim of hatred, bigotry, stereotypes.
Absolutely. I feel like Lisa said before, the most education I've received on Asian American history might have just been just now with your presentation. So thank you for that. And then a second question we actually have for you, Dr. Kim, is do you have any recommended resources for someone who wants to continue their education on Asian American history?
Yeah, so many. I would recommend, depending on where you're coming from, novels. For instance, I can put it in the chat box, but Celeste Ng's Everything I Never Told You is a wonderful novel that lets us into this idea of being Asian American in a small town America. There's, of course, great history books. The New History of Asian America by Shelley Lee is a great history book. And also just, there's a lot of Asian Americans amongst us. So have a conversation with your friends, have conversation with your peers, your other faculty, staff, ask, how does this hate crimes and Asian incidents make you feel? What can I do for you? Where do you think this comes from? And what can we talk about?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kim, I'm so sorry for the rapid fire questions at you. We appreciate. Oh, did someone have a question from the audience? Looks like someone came off mute. Maybe not. Oh, go ahead.
I had a question. I learned so much from these presentations, from this discussion. It was unbelievably helpful for me to understand. I did not realize exactly, like many Americans, many white Americans, I did not realize how much has been missing from the story of America, because like we silence all, basically everything that was said. I learned so much from. And my question regards the number of participants. I see that it's the number 57, and there are so many more people in this country who would benefit so much from learning about what we heard today. What I'm wondering, what sorry, it's hard to find the right words. What can be done to truly expand the number of 57 people learning to as many as we can? Like how do you go about the fact that this is only a group of 57 people? How do we get this to go further? Because this is so important.
Professor Kim, do you want to try to respond, and then we'll try to respond here from the University of Hartford.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian, for that question. I think that's a really difficult question, right? Where do we go from here, and how do we go from here? I think the starting point would be to, again, as I said before, to acknowledge that Asian Americans are a quintessential part of Americans, and that that killing of Asian Americans kills us all, same as BLM, killing of one Black body kills us all, that it's not what America stands for, it's not what America strives to be, it should not be what it is, right? Even though sadly our history tells us differently. So one of the things, again, education is important. There is a bill, SB 678, right now, which seeks to have Asian American studies as part of core curriculum in social studies in high school. Please support that bill. Reach out to other people, ask how they are, know their history. And since this is a university environment, probably University of Hartford can offer events can continue to offer events and like this, start conversations, talk to people, offer spaces for conversations and resources to flourish.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that. I just want to echo, and this would be a nice segue to get to our Director of Student Engagement and Inclusion. We will continue as an institution to ensure that we have programming and initiatives that will help to foster learning, conversations, as Dr. Kim said. And again, if you have any ideas, we have an Asian American Association Club, Asian Association Club, that you can possibly get in additional information from. So the university is making all attempts to provide the venues and the programs that will help you. And I'm pleased to share with you that, and she'll share some additional information with you, Lonya Jackson, who's our Director for Student Engagement and Inclusion. She's gonna add to what we've just said. Thank
I
you.
have one quick question before we leave for Dr. Kim. I was wondering, thank you so much for your presentation, but I was wondering, because of the expansion of Japan attacking Korea and Manchuria in World War II, how the relationship within America was between Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, and Chinese Americans. Do you have anything about that subject that you could recommend?
Yeah, I can give you a quick answer. So even before that time, during that time, Japan has colonized Korea and has been also colonizing many other parts of Asia. So there was a lot of different nationalist movement and anti-colonial movement that was happening, not only in Asia, but that was quintessential in American soil, because these people had more liberty to pursue their activities, unlike back at home in Asia, where they were heavily scrutinized. So these people continued to have different express the importance of this anti-colonial movement. However, what is also important to acknowledge is that there, however, was the shared experience of racism that these people faced. So, for instance, in Quiet Odyssey by Mary Pigg, she talks about this anti-colonial movement a lot, but she also talks about her Japanese American friend who she wanted to help out when she was sent to the internment camp. So she helps protecting her property. So that's a really interesting way in which that we not only see this kind of strong ethnic identity as an immigrant happening, but also this trans ethnic or Asian American sentiment burgeoning in from even first generation immigrants because of the shared experience of racism that they face. However, when the Japanese Americans were actually interned, a lot of Korean and Chinese Americans had to wear signs that "I'm not a Jap," because they were often policed on the street, being asked, "Why are you here?"
Thank you so much.
Can I make a little contribution? My name is Esther Odumpton, and I'm an African American, originally from Africa, Ghana. And I work with Lim Ping Peng, was like a young sister to me. I really have to applaud you guys for this conference. It's about time that these things are addressed. We live it daily. We feel it daily. We work 100 times harder than most of our counterparts. And sometimes you have no words to explain to a young child what racism is when it's part of your life. You accept it so much that it becomes normal. And so I really, really, really applaud you. It's not late to address this. I cry. I put up a strong face, but this afternoon, you guys have really, I've been listening to you and I'm healing. I've wept the entire time. You know, I mean, doing business here in Connecticut, doing business in Massachusetts, we face it. You know, I mean, we can go on and on and on. And I think it starts with education, because those people that really performs this act, uh, maybe they haven't walked a mile in some of our shoes before, because if they have, they will feel what we feel. You know, there are times we feel like we're not welcome. And it's so sad because I mean, uh, we provide employment, and I tell people that look, I've never been on food stamps. I came here with nothing, and I'm living the American dream. I've never lived on food stamps. I've never taken anything for free because that's not what we were taught. But we get it shoved down our throats. And I mean, discrimination one-on-one. I can go on and on and on and on. I see Lee sometimes, I mean, hey, in our jobs, in our even the people we employ, they say it straight in our face. Oh, the Chinese and the African, you know, and it's said so casually. I mean, you know how ignorant it is. And so thank you very much. And I pray that such conferences, I mean, such meetings will be more often. It's about education, 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 and we will get there. We will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. It's obvious that we don't have enough time to have these conversations. 1 hour does not do this conversation justice. It's been my pleasure to share this space with each and every one of you. I want to thank our speakers, AG Tong, Professor Kim, for your insights. I want to take this opportunity to turn it over for a short few minutes to my colleague and friend Gary Hong from CAPS, who's going to share some information with you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to echo the sentiments first. Very appreciative to be a part of this space and to hear from Attorney General Tong and Professor Kim. I think just in addition to wanting to feel safe, or our ABBY community wanting to feel safe, like education on the history of racism against our community, I think is definitely at the forefront. So I am both a graduate student here at the University of Hartford and a doctoral trainee at the Counseling and Psychological Services. So I'll speak first from that capacity as a doctoral trainee in promoting CAP services. I think in the commenting on the invisibility piece that's been mentioned multiple times, it can be easy to internalize some of this pain. And while it is easy, and while it's important to have the education, just wanted to talk about CAP services. If anybody does want to reach out, I'll share the phone number as well as the email for our office manager if somebody wants to set up an appointment, just going to talk about racial stress or anything that might be a stressor, especially in current racial climates. So that's CAPS information. And then if I want to speak specifically, oh, thank you, Lonya, I think, about the student of color group Speak that I started both as a member of as a doctoral trainee at CAPS, but also prior, just as a student here, in hopes to kind of bolster a sense of community among students of color here at University of Hartford. So the space happens every other week. And it serves, I think, two big functions, both the space for students of color to kind of talk about concerns they have about our racial climate as people of color here, but also just as a space where people of color, students of color can come together and have that shared identity to talk about whatever is going on. Those are the big things I wanted to hit on. So I'll share that information in the comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I just also wanted to share some other campus resources that are available to students, faculty, and staff. Our Alumni of Color Task Force, directed by Dr. Jolie Rock. The Asian Student Association, which you heard some about earlier. CAPS, which Gary just mentioned. I-SEE Affinity Group. The Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, and the Office of Student Engagement and Inclusion. I also want to bring your attention to a couple of events that are happening on campus. Art Against Racism, which is a fundraiser that the Hartford Art School is putting on. That's happening between March 29th and April 5th. And this is in response to anti-Asian violence in Atlanta. And there will be more information posted about this event on the Unity page on our website. The second event, our next town hall, which will be happening on April 1st, and that is COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. So please join us for our next town hall. Thank you all so much for coming out. I want to thank Erin Isaacs, our Dean of Students, our Provost, Frederick Schweitzer, Rena, Lisa, Chris, Gary, the Office of Student Engagement and Inclusion, and the Office of Diversity and Community Engagement. And I want to thank each and every one of you for spending this hour and 10 minutes with us. Again, not enough time to have these important dialogues, but thank you all for spending this time with us. And we will see you at the next event.